Ontario's story begins long before the idea of Canada ever existed, back when ice still covered the land and the Great Lakes had not yet taken their shape. Before borders, before maps, before written language, before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. More than 13,000 years ago, this place looked very different. Massive glaciers still stretched across the landscape. Rivers had not yet carved their familiar paths. Forests were only beginning to return. As the ice slowly retreated northward, the land emerged piece by piece, revealing rock, soil, and fresh water. And into this newly opened world, the first people arrived. They followed the seasons and the animals, moving carefully across tundra and young woodland. Caribou herds guided their routes. Lakes and rivers became natural highways. These early paleo-indigenous hunters shaped tools from stone, bone, and wood. They built shelters against the wind and learned how to survive long winters and brief summers. Life required patience, observation, respect for the rhythms of the earth. Over generations, their knowledge deepened. Trails became familiar routes. Camps returned to the same sheltered places year after year. Stories passed from elders to children, carrying memory across centuries. Slowly, societies grew more connected. Trade networks stretched far beyond the horizon. Birch bark canoes slipped quietly across lakes and along winding rivers, linking the Great Lakes to distant regions. Copper, shells, stone tools, and ceremonial objects traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometers. Ontario was never isolated. It was already part of something larger. Among the most influential nations were the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, the Odawa, and the Algonquin peoples. These were not scattered groups surviving at the margins of the wilderness. They were organized societies with systems of governance, diplomacy, and law refined over countless generations. Councils gathered. Agreements were debated. Decisions were made through patience and consensus. Oral traditions preserved history with remarkable care. Stories of origins, migrations, and responsibilities to the land. Forests, lakes, and animals were not seen as resources to be claimed. They were relationships to be honored. For thousands of years, this land was shaped by indigenous governance, trade, spirituality, and stewardship. Long before any colony, long before any empire, Ontario already had a history. Then, slowly, another world began to drift closer. In the early 1600s, small wooden ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean, carried by wind and current. Their passengers were not settlers at first, but explorers, men searching for trade routes, wealth, and advantage. They followed the great river inland. In 1610, Étienne Brulé traveled deep into the interior, guided by indigenous knowledge and established canoe paths. He learned local languages. He relied on the people already living here. He was not discovering empty land. He was entering a place that was already known. Soon after, Samuel de Champlain arrived. With him came the growing influence of France. The French did not immediately build large towns. Instead, they formed alliances. Relationships mattered more than numbers. Trade became the bridge between worlds. At the center of it all was one small animal, the beaver. In Europe, beaver felt hats were fashionable and expensive. Demand seemed endless. Pelts became as valuable as currency. Canoes that once carried food and tools now carried bundles of fur. Trading posts appeared along rivers and lakes. Metal knives, kettles, Cloth and firearms were exchanged for carefully prepared skins. For a time, cooperation brought mutual benefit, but the balance was fragile. Along with trade came things no one could see: diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza. Illness moved faster than any canoe. Communities with no natural immunity were struck with devastating speed. Villages fell silent. Families vanished within a single season. Some nations lost half their population, sometimes more. The forests remained. The lakes still reflected the sky. But the people who had known this land for thousands of years faced losses beyond memory. At the same time, competition over trade routes grew sharper. Old rivalries deepened. New conflicts emerged. Throughout the mid-1600s, a series of struggles, later called the Beaver Wars, reshaped the region. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy expanded its influence. The Huron-Wendat and others were displaced. Entire communities migrated or scattered, seeking safety. The map of alliances changed again and again. Yet European presence continued to grow. French missionaries built small missions near villages. Wooden forts rose beside narrow waterways. A few permanent settlements took root. Smoke from chimneys began to mix with the morning mist. Ontario was becoming a meeting ground between worlds. But France was not the only empire watching. To the south and east, Britain had its own ambitions. By the mid-1700s, rivalry between the two powers could no longer be contained. What began as trade competition spread into open war. The 7 Years' War reached forests and rivers far from Europe's capitals. Forts were captured and recaptured. Supply lines were cut. Indigenous nations were drawn into alliances, each side promising protection or advantage. Battles echoed through places that had once known only the sounds of wind and water. In 1760, British forces captured Montreal. French rule in much of North America quietly came to an end. 3 years later, the Treaty of Paris made it official. Ontario, once part of New France, now belonged to the British Empire. A new flag flew above the forts. But the land itself had not changed. Indigenous nations still lived here. French settlers still farmed along the rivers. And now British officials arrived, trying to govern a place they barely understood. To prevent conflict, the Crown issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It recognized that indigenous lands could not simply be taken. Treaties would be required. Settlement would be regulated. On paper, it promised protection. In practice, pressure for land continued to grow. To the south, revolution was brewing. When the American colonies rebelled against Britain in 1775, the conflict reshaped the continent. And when the war ended, thousands who had remained loyal to the Crown fled north. They arrived with wagons, tools, and families. These United Empire loyalists settled along the St. Lawrence River and the shores of the Great Lakes. Forests were cleared. Cabins rose from freshly cut timber. Roads slowly connected one small settlement to the next. Church bells and schoolhouses followed. Ontario began to take on a distinctly British character. By 1791, Britain divided the vast colony in two: Lower Canada to the east, Upper Canada to the west. Upper Canada, the future Ontario, adopted British laws, courts, and parliamentary traditions. The foundations of today's provincial government quietly took shape. Yet peace along the border would not last. Once again, tension grew with the United States. And once again, Ontario would find itself on the front line. In 1812, war returned to the Great Lakes. Smoke drifted over the water at dawn. Cannon fire echoed across rivers that had once been quiet canoe routes. American forces crossed the border, believing Upper Canada would fall quickly. Many assumed the small colony could not defend itself. They were wrong. British regulars, local militias, and Indigenous allies resisted again and again, using their knowledge of the forests, lakes, and narrow trails to their advantage. Battles flared at places that would later become familiar names: Queenston Heights, York, Lundy's Lane. Towns were burned, crops were trampled. Families fled their homes with only what they could carry. War, for many, arrived not as glory, but as disruption. Yet cooperation grew in the face of danger. The Shawnee leader Tecumseh worked to unite Indigenous nations in a common cause, hoping to protect their lands from American expansion. His leadership left a lasting mark on the region's history. Stories of ordinary people quietly entered local memory too. Messengers walking long distances through forest paths, neighbors warning one another in the night. When the fighting finally ended in 1815, the borders remained much the same. But something less visible had changed. A new identity had begun to form. Not fully British, not American, but something rooted in the experience of this place itself. Upper Canada had endured, and with endurance came confidence. Councils gathered. Agreements were debated. Decisions were made through patience and consensus. Oral traditions preserved history with remarkable care. Stories of origins, migrations, and responsibilities to the land. Forests, lakes, and animals were not seen as resources to be claimed. They were relationships to be honored. For thousands of years, this land was shaped by Indigenous governance, trade, spirituality, and stewardship. Long before any colony, long before any empire, Ontario already had a history. In the decades that followed, settlements expanded steadily. More ships crossed the Atlantic. Immigrants arrived from Britain, Ireland, and Scotland, carrying trunks, tools, and hopes for land of their own. They cleared fields, planted crops, and built small towns beside rivers and crossroads. Grain mills turned. Blacksmith shops rang with metal. Churches and markets gathered people together. Life was still difficult, but communities grew. Roads improved. Mail routes connected distant settlements. Steamboats churned across the Great Lakes, shortening journeys that once took weeks. Yet political power remained concentrated in the hands of a small elite. In Upper Canada, a tight circle of wealthy families, sometimes called the Family Compact, controlled much of the government, the courts, and the land. To many ordinary settlers, it felt distant, closed, unresponsive. Frustration slowly built. Farmers, laborers, and reformers began calling for something simple, a greater voice in how they were governed. Public meetings were held. Newspapers criticized corruption. Debates grew louder. By 1837, tension finally spilled over. Small groups of rebels, led by figures like William Lyon Mackenzie, marched toward Toronto, hoping to force political change. But the uprising was brief. Poorly organized and quickly suppressed, it failed to achieve its immediate goals. Still, the message reached Britain clearly. The colony could not be governed the old way forever. Soon after, Lord Durham was sent to investigate the unrest. His report recommended sweeping reforms and a new idea that would gradually reshape the future. Responsible government. A system where elected representatives, not distant elites, would hold real power. Change came slowly, but it came. In 1841, Upper and Lower Canada were united into a single province of Canada. Then, in 1848, responsible government was finally granted. For the first time, local voters had meaningful control over their leadership. Ontario was learning how to govern itself. Meanwhile, the landscape continued to transform. By the mid-1800s, the sound of axes and saws echoed through the forests. Railway tracks stretched across farmland and rock, linking towns that had once felt impossibly far apart. Steam engines carried timber, grain, and passengers faster than ever before. Travel that once took days could now be done in hours. Distance seemed to shrink. Northern regions revealed new wealth beneath the soil: gold, nickel, silver. Mining towns appeared almost overnight, rough and temporary at first, then gradually permanent. Logging camps floated timber downriver toward growing cities. Industry hummed where quiet forest had once stood. Ontario was no longer only rural. It was becoming industrial. Cities expanded. Toronto, Hamilton, Ottawa. Each grew busier, louder, more crowded. Brick factories rose beside smokestacks. Streetcars rattled along busy roads. Banks, warehouses, and government buildings reshaped the skyline. Immigrants continued to arrive, not just from Britain, but from across Europe and beyond. Each wave added new languages and traditions to the streets. Opportunity drew them, so did necessity. But expansion carried a heavy cost. As settlement pushed outward, Indigenous communities were pressured into treaties that transferred vast territories to the Crown. Promises were often misunderstood, delayed, or broken. Families were displaced from lands they had lived on for generations. Later, government policies imposed residential schools, separating children from their parents and attempting to erase language and culture. The effects would echo far into the future. Even as Ontario prospered, deep wounds were forming beneath the surface. By the 1860s, political leaders began to imagine something larger still. The colonies of British North America, scattered and vulnerable, faced economic uncertainty and fears of American expansion. A new idea emerged: union, confederation. And in 1867, that idea became reality. The British North America Act quietly stitched several colonies together into something new: the Dominion of Canada. The former province of Canada was divided once more. Ontario to the west, Quebec to the east. For the first time, Ontario existed as a province in its own right. Toronto, already growing quickly, became its capital. There were no grand celebrations for most ordinary people, just another morning. But beneath the surface, something significant had changed. Decisions that once came from distant governors and overseas officials would now be made closer to home. Ontario would shape more of its own future, and that future arrived quickly. Steel rails stretched farther each year, cutting across forests, farmland, and rock. Railway crews worked through heat and snow, laying track that connected the south to the north, the lakes to the interior. Small towns that had once felt remote suddenly found themselves linked to cities. Goods moved faster. Letters arrived sooner. Travel became ordinary. Distance, which had once defined life, began to fade. In the north, prospectors uncovered mineral wealth buried deep in the Canadian Shield: gold, silver, nickel. News spread fast. Mining camps appeared almost overnight: rows of rough wooden buildings, lanterns glowing against the dark, the steady ring of pickaxes echoing through the trees. Some camps vanished as quickly as they formed. Others grew into permanent towns. Logging followed a similar rhythm. Rivers carried vast bundles of timber south toward sawmills and shipyards. Forests that had stood for centuries were cut and floated downstream, feeding construction in expanding cities. Ontario's natural resources fueled its growth. By the late 1800s, factories multiplied. Brick smokestacks rose above Toronto and Hamilton. Foundries, textile mills, and workshops hummed from dawn until dusk. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and hot metal. Work was steady, but often hard. Long hours, little protection, few guarantees. Still, people came. Immigrants arrived in growing numbers, stepping off trains and ships with suitcases and bundles, searching for stability and opportunity. Streets filled with unfamiliar accents. Neighborhoods formed around shared languages and traditions. Ontario's identity began to widen. It was no longer only British. It was becoming something more varied, more layered, more complex. By the early 1900s, the province had become the economic heart of the young country. Banks clustered along Toronto streets. Rail yards stretched for blocks. Ships crowded Great Lakes harbors. Grain, timber, minerals, and manufactured goods flowed outward in every direction. Prosperity seemed steady, reliable, permanent. But history rarely moves in straight lines. In 1914, war in Europe shattered that illusion. When the First World War began, Ontario quickly transformed into Canada's industrial backbone. Factories that once made farm tools and machinery shifted to rifles, uniforms, shells, and vehicles. Assembly lines sped up. Workdays grew longer. Trains carried young men south to enlistment stations and then east toward ships bound for overseas battlefields. Tens of thousands left. Many did not return. Across the province, small towns hung service flags in windows. Churches filled with quiet prayers. Letters from the front were read and reread at kitchen tables. Women stepped into factory jobs in unprecedented numbers, keeping production moving while families adjusted to new roles and responsibilities. When the war finally ended, relief mixed with grief. Entire communities had changed. The 1920s that followed felt lighter at first. Music drifted from dance halls. Automobiles rattled down newly paved streets. Cinemas flickered with black and white films. Radios brought voices and news into living rooms. Cities grew brighter, faster, more modern. But the prosperity was fragile. In 1929, stock markets collapsed. Factories slowed, then stopped. The Great Depression spread quietly but relentlessly across Ontario. Jobs disappeared. Savings vanished. Bread lines lengthened. Proud workers searched day after day for anything they could find. In northern towns dependent on mines and forestry, the hardship was especially sharp. When the work ended, entire communities seemed to hold their breath. Yet even in difficulty, people adapted. Neighbors shared food. Gardens expanded behind small houses. Governments began introducing relief programs, public works, and new protections for workers. The foundations of Ontario's modern social safety net slowly took shape. Just as recovery began, the world was pulled into war once more. In 1939, another conflict overseas demanded attention, and once again, Ontario shifted into wartime rhythm. Factories roared back to life, this time producing aircraft, vehicles, radios, and munitions. Shipyards and airfields operated around the clock. The steady hum of industry filled the air. Communities learned the routine: ration books, blackout curtains, letters from abroad. By the time peace returned in 1945, Ontario had changed again. The province that emerged from war was more industrial, more urban, and more connected than ever before. And it was about to enter one of the fastest periods of growth in its history. The years after 1945 felt different, quieter at first, as if the province were catching its breath. Soldiers returned home carrying small suitcases and larger memories. Many wanted the same simple things: steady work, a house of their own, a safe place to raise a family. Governments encouraged that vision. Loans became easier to secure. New neighborhoods were planned at the edges of cities. Fields that had once grown corn and hay were gradually replaced with rows of modest brick homes. Street by street, suburbs appeared: driveways, front lawns, freshly planted trees no taller than a person. Places like Scarborough, Mississauga, North York, and Brampton expanded quickly, transforming from small communities into sprawling residential districts. Highways followed. Wide ribbons of pavement connected downtown cores to distant neighborhoods. Cars replaced streetcars for many commuters. Travel that once required careful planning became routine. Morning and evening traffic became part of daily life. Ontario was spreading outward. At the same time, the province invested heavily in public services. Schools multiplied to accommodate the growing population. New colleges and universities opened their doors, welcoming students whose parents might never have imagined higher education as an option. Lecture halls filled, libraries expanded, research labs quietly pushed forward discoveries in medicine, engineering, and science. Education became not just a privilege, but an expectation. Healthcare changed too. Publicly funded medical care expanded across the province, ensuring that a visit to the doctor was no longer a luxury reserved for a few. Hospitals grew larger. Vaccination programs reduced once feared diseases. Life expectancy steadily increased. For many families, everyday life felt more secure than it ever had before. And then, another transformation began: immigration. Earlier generations had come mostly from Britain or Europe. Now, newcomers arrived from everywhere: from the Caribbean, from South Asia, from East Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Latin America. Airports welcomed a constant flow of arrivals, each carrying different languages, recipes, music, and memories of distant homes. Ontario's streets slowly changed. Shop signs appeared in multiple languages. New restaurants filled the air with unfamiliar spices. Festivals, parades, and markets introduced traditions that blended into the existing fabric of the province. Toronto, especially, began to feel like a crossroads of the world. Neighborhoods developed distinct identities, yet overlapped in everyday life. A patchwork of cultures sharing the same sidewalks and transit lines. The idea of what it meant to be Ontarian widened. It no longer pointed to one background or one story. It became something broader, something shared. The social changes of the 1960s and 70s added another layer. Across campuses and city streets, people questioned old assumptions. Civil rights movements, women's rights campaigns, labor organizing, and environmental activism reshaped public conversations. Protests were held. Newspapers debated. Laws slowly evolved. Workplace protections strengthened. Discrimination laws expanded. family law adapted to reflect changing realities. Ontario's institutions bent, sometimes reluctantly, toward greater inclusion. At the same time, the environment demanded attention. Decades of heavy industry had left their mark on rivers and air. Smog sometimes hung over cities in a dull haze. Shorelines showed signs of pollution. Gradually, conservation became a priority. Provincial parks were protected. Clean water initiatives launched. Regulations aimed to safeguard the Great Lakes, the vast freshwater system that had always sustained the region. People began to understand that growth alone was not enough. The land itself needed care. For Indigenous communities, these decades carried a different kind of reckoning. Survivors of residential schools began sharing their experiences more openly. Stories that had long been kept quiet, of separation, punishment, and cultural loss, entered public awareness. Legal challenges advanced treaty rights and land claims. Leaders pushed for recognition, sovereignty, and the preservation of language and tradition. Ontario slowly began to confront parts of its past that had been ignored. The process was uncomfortable, incomplete, but necessary. Meanwhile, the economy shifted again. The factories that had once defined Ontario's strength began to change. Automation reduced jobs. Some companies moved production overseas. Familiar smokestacks went quiet. Communities built around a single plant or mill suddenly faced uncertainty. Yet even as one chapter closed, another opened. Service industries expanded. Finance, education, healthcare, technology. Office towers replaced many old warehouses. Computers appeared on desks. The quiet glow of screens replaced the noise of assembly lines. Toronto grew into a global financial center, home to major banks and corporate headquarters. Startups and research firms clustered near universities, experimenting with new ideas in software, telecommunications, and medicine. Innovation became the new resource. By the turn of the 21st century, Ontario was no longer defined mainly by what it mined or manufactured. It was increasingly defined by what it knew. Universities attracted students from around the world. Laboratories advanced research in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and environmental science. Film and television productions filled city streets with cameras and lights, earning Toronto the nickname Hollywood North. The province felt modern, connected, global. And yet, familiar challenges remained. Housing grew more expensive. Commutes grew longer. Inequality widened between neighborhoods. Healthcare systems strained under rising demand. And the climate itself began to feel less predictable. Hotter summers, stronger storms, floods, fires, and sudden temperature swings. Once again, Ontario faced the need to adapt, because adaptation had always been its quiet talent. From glaciers to trade routes, from forts to factories, from railways to research labs, the province had never stood still for long. It changed, adjusted, rebuilt, again and again. And through every transformation, one truth remained constant. People kept arriving, kept building, kept imagining what this place could become next. Ontario's story, like the rivers that cross it, has never truly stopped flowing. It simply moves forward, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, carrying the past with it as it shapes the future. And so the story continues, not with a single turning point or final chapter, but with small, everyday moments. Morning light over the lakes, traffic humming along distant highways, voices in dozens of languages drifting through city streets, snow falling quietly across northern forests, Ontario has never been just one thing. It has been many places at once. Ancient rock and young cities, deep forests and glass towers, old canoe routes and crowded subways, layer upon layer of history, resting gently on the same ground. Long before borders, people walked these shores. Long after today's buildings fade, others will walk them too. Generations arrive. They build. They adapt. They leave their stories behind. And the land remembers all of it. The rivers still follow their patient paths to the lakes. The seasons still turn, as they always have. Winter to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, over and over again. Ontario changes. Ontario endures. And somewhere tonight, beneath the same wide sky, the story quietly carries on,